Can a seller cancel a real estate transaction? More specifically, when can a seller cancel a real estate transaction? I get asked this question on a fairly frequent basis, largely because a buyer has more flexibility. A buyer can back out during the first 17 days of an agreement. Typically, there's a inspection contingency for 17 days or 21 days for the loan. So it's easy for a buyer to decide to cancel and get their earnest money deposit back. But what happens when the seller wants to cancel? And this has happened more frequently in the recent future. Can a seller cancel a real estate transaction? More specifically, when can a seller cancel a real estate transaction? I get asked this question on a fairly regular basis, largely because it's harder for a seller to get out of a transaction than a buyer. A buyer automatically has 17 days with the inspection contingency or 21 days with the loan contingency to back out and get their earnest money deposit back, whereas a seller doesn't have that same sort of option. The seller is essentially stuck unless the buyer breaches or does something that allows the seller to cancel. Now, the residential purchase agreement has explicit verbiage that addresses this topic, and we'll go over to it and then I'll explain. So you'll find it in paragraph 14D, and there's 14D 1 and 2. We'll start with 14D 1, and I'll read the text from the RPA, the purchase agreement, and then I'll explain it in less dense terms. But regarding the seller right to cancel, it says, if by the time specified in this agreement, and they're referring to contingency periods when they say that, buyer does not deliver to seller a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement, then seller, after first delivering a notice to perform, that's very important right there, and I'll explain it in a minute, may cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by the buyer. So this is saying if the buyer doesn't remove in writing their contingencies, whatever contingency is expiring must be removed in writing by the buyer. It doesn't go away automatically. If the buyer doesn't do that punctually, then the seller can cancel. But it says that the seller must first deliver to the buyer a notice to perform, the CAR form NBP. And so before I expand on that any further, let me jump over to 14D2. That's the second provision that relates to the seller canceling. So I'll paraphrase this because there's a lot here that I don't just want to read to you. You can read it on your own if you're really interested. But basically it gives other reasons, because in 14D1 it said, basically, if the buyer doesn't remove their contingencies when they're due, the seller can cancel. But don't forget, the seller needs to send a notice to perform. That's what that provision says. This states when a buyer doesn't fulfill their obligation, and it lists reasons other than the contingency period. So it's saying things like if the buyer doesn't deliver their earnest money deposit, or if their earnest money deposit bounces. Let's say they give a check to escrow and it bounces. Or they don't furnish a proof of funds or a pre-qualification letter from the lender. So basically in an RPA, there are all these obligations that a buyer has. And if the buyer doesn't fulfill one of these obligations, the seller can issue a notice to perform for that reason too. So it's not just that the seller can issue a notice to perform when the contingency period expires. It's also these items in paragraph 14D2. And these are the other reasons, and these are just restating the buyer's obligations that are listed elsewhere in the RPA. But it's saying, hey, by the way, in addition to the contingency expiration, if the buyer doesn't do any of the things listed here in 14D2, then the seller can send a notice to perform and then cancel. No matter what, the seller needs to send a notice to perform and then wait 2 days. If the seller sent it on a Wednesday, then they have to wait Thursday and Friday, and then Saturday morning they can send the cancellation. And the cancellation Well, that's a separate topic, but it doesn't need to be signed by both parties. It can be done unilaterally. But that 2-day period must be waited by the seller. And I should mention that the 2 days of the notice to perform can be sent prior to the expiration. So if a seller is worried that the buyer's not going to perform or not going to remove contingencies, the seller can send the notice to perform 2 days prior to the expiration. No earlier, but 2 days. And in that way, when the expiration date comes, the seller can immediately cancel. But to summarize, the seller can only cancel when the buyer breaches an obligation. The seller can't just decide to cancel. Sure, they could sabotage a contract, but they'd be liable for damages to the buyer and the broker. The broker is entitled to a full listing commission if a seller obstructs the sale of the property. But so otherwise than that, the seller cannot cancel. The buyer must be in breach for the seller to cancel. All right, let's move ahead. Keep in mind, there's 2 days that the seller must wait. So sometimes I have agents call and they say, hey, the buyer never delivered the EMD. Can we cancel? It's been 5 days. And I say, no, you have to send a notice to perform to the buyer first, the NBP form. You can't just cancel because the buyer never delivered their EMD. There's a process outlined in the RPA that says the seller must send a notice to perform, wait 2 days, and then cancel. And it doesn't matter what the reason is. It's any reason, any breach that the buyer makes. What happens when the buyer doesn't close escrow on time? Sometimes I see agents send a notice to perform. That's the wrong form. The correct form is a demand to close. It's a CAR form DCE, Delta Charlie Echo, DCE, demand to close escrow. And unlike the notice to perform, there are 3 days that the seller must wait. And the seller can send that 3 days prior to close of escrow if they want to enforce that close of escrow date on the day. But think of it like this. A notice to perform must be sent by the seller in order to cancel throughout the escrow. And then at the very end, the notice to perform doesn't matter anymore. It's all about a demand to close. If the close of escrow date's coming and the buyer's not closing on time, the seller sends the form DCE, demand to close, waits 3 days, and then the seller can cancel. One last thing about earnest money deposits. As you noticed, I wonder if I can jump back here. As you noticed here, it says that at the very bottom that the seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit. This is assuming that there's a contingency in place. So with a notice to perform, if there's a contingency, the seller can cancel if the buyer doesn't remove it. But unless the buyer removes it, the EMD is protected. The earnest money deposit is protected, and the buyer gets it back. Only when the buyer removes all contingencies is that earnest money deposit non-refundable. And then at that point, when the demand to close is sent, we'll jump ahead here back to the last slide. If the demand to close is sent and all the contingencies have been removed, then the seller has a claim for that buyer's earnest money deposit. If you have any questions, please email info@balboateam.com if you're interested in 100% commission real estate in the state of California. Again, feel welcome to email info@balboateam.com, and I do hope that you found this helpful. Thank you for watching.